so we can do the best work possible. I certainly really enjoyed the last training, and I'm really looking forward to this one as well. But before we start that, I need to take attendance. So I'm going to call out each person's name, and if you can just tell me if you're present, I would appreciate that. So I'm here, Lisa Ortiz, I'm the chair. Gary Dean. I'm not seeing Gary at the moment. Dave Smith.
I'm here.
Yep, Dave's here.
Hi,
Martine Ennis. I don't think I see him. Not yet. Julie Evans.
Here.
Great. Anika Montgomery. I see her. She raised her hand. Sasha Ridley. I don't think I see her yet. Gary Coffey, well, we know you're here because we just spoke to you, but can you say that?
I'm still here.
You're still here. And Jim Miller.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay, so again, I can't tell you how excited we are to have you back and to learn all the good things you have to teach us. So please go ahead and take it away. Oop, you're on mute.
Let me start that sentence again then. It's great to be back with you again. I enjoyed our last training as well, and so it is really nice to be able to see all of you back for more, even after sitting through 3 hours of it previously. So I can assume that all of you can see my screen now. Great.
Yep.
So all of you know who I am, but I have brought someone with me this evening who will be taking on the training in regards to the investigations piece. So I just want to take a minute and let Jason Wechter introduce himself. Jason?
Yes, well, I feel my experience pales compared to that of Gary and Jim's, certainly in terms of the breadth of places that I'm sure they've worked. But I've been an investigator for 43 years, none of that in law enforcement. I started out doing criminal defense investigation. In 1983, I went to work as one of the first employees for San Francisco's oversight entity, the Office of Citizen Complaints, which investigates complaints against San Francisco police officers. It was a newly established agency, unfortunately, got off to a very poor start. So after a year, I went to the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. I returned to the Office of Citizen Complaints in 1998, was there for almost 20 years. And during that period, I became involved with NACOLE and served 7 years on its board of directors. I spent 3.5 years doing EEO investigations for a public agency, and now I'm a supervising investigator for the Oakland Community Police Review Agency, which investigates complaints against Oakland Police Department officers. And I also am about to start sitting in the seat that all of you are in. I'm a newly appointed member of the San Francisco Sheriff's Department Oversight Board. So you folks could have a lot to teach me in that respect. But I've done a lot of investigations of complaints, and what I'm going to talk about today is some of the things you should look at as you review investigations done by, I believe it's the Professional Responsibility Unit of the Arlington County Police Department, just to give you some sense of what a good investigation is versus a less good or bad investigation, how you can view these things with a critical eye. And again, Gary and Jim probably have much more sophisticated perspective on this, having worked in law enforcement, certainly Gary. But so that's a little bit about my background and experience. And as we go through this, please, if you have questions, ask them at the time rather than saving them. I like this to be as interactive as possible, and you may bring up really good points that the others should hear, and that I will hopefully be able to respond to. So with that, should we get started, Cami?
Yes, thanks, Jason. But before you dive in, I just want to talk about exactly what we're going to be covering. So today we are going to be talking about effective practices in conducting and reviewing investigations. And then we're also going to spend some time at the end today talking about recommended reporting practices for civilian oversight entities specifically. I would like to take just another moment before you start, Jason, and just see if there are any other questions or comments that anybody has from the last training module that we did that came to mind afterwards. Any additional thoughts? I always like to take a little bit of time at the beginning for people to have a chance to ask those questions. Okay, hearing none. If you think of some later, like Jason said, we do appreciate you taking the time to ask the question when you have it, just so we can have a little more interaction. So feel free to ask if something comes to mind later. So with that, I will turn things over to you, Jason.
Thank you. And I meant to say thank you all for the service you're doing. I know this is a volunteer board and you all have probably very busy other lives, and this is a continuing commitment. So thank you for that. And although I'm not part of your community, I'm part of the Oversight community, which you are now part of. So welcome and thank you for the work you are doing. So we're going to start, when we look at good versus bad investigation, we'll start with the bad and then move to the positive. So we'll talk about some of the characteristics of what you could call a bad or deficient or less than ideal investigation, or whatever type of nomenclature you want to use. So if we could have the first slide, please, Cami. So first of all, it's going to have a poor investigation is going to have a narrow focus. So you may start with a complaint about a specific part of an encounter that an individual is upset about. And poor investigation will just focus very narrowly on the allegations that the complainant specifically makes, and will ignore other possible misconduct that is not raised by the complainant. So most members of the public are not going to be familiar with certain seizure law or laws about detention, or with your police agency's internal regulations or the training officers receive. But the investigators conducting those complaints are familiar with that. And they should be able to look at the entire encounter and say, is there anything here that the officers did that was not in compliance with their with the agency's policies, with the law? Because this is, as an administrative investigation, the goal is not just to address the complaint from a member of the public, but as a management tool to identify deficiencies in the performance of their employees. So this would be true for any employer. If your employees are deficient in how they interact with members of the public or your customers, let's say, you want to be aware of that and you want to remediate that. And that may involve different training, it may involve different supervision. But if you're not aware, you can't fix it, and you don't want that problem to go unchecked. So as part of that would be, in a poor investigation, a failure to identify all the relevant allegations. And we're going to get to that when we talk about a sample case, because as you go through an investigation, it's very important to identify what rules or policies are potential apply and what the allegations are in terms of potential violations. It would overlook relevant facts or evidence, failed to obtain a complete narrative account from all parties interviewed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss interviewing. But the watchword is, for good investigators, shut up and listen. You want the other person to talk. You don't want to talk a lot, particularly when you're being audio recorded. You want to hear the other person's voice. You do not want to be interrupting incessantly and talking over them. There would be a failure to address inconsistencies in an interview subject's account. So this could be, for instance, taking what an officer says at face value without asking follow-up questions, asking for details. The same would be true of a complainant. You want to drill down, and if someone is not being specific, if they're using vague language, say, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that a little more? The narrowly focused investigation would fail to hold supervisors accountable, because if a line officer is not performing as they should, you want to say, why is this? Is there some supervisory failure? Why do they feel free to violate the rules? Do they know the rules? Is their supervisor watching what they're doing and reviewing what they're doing properly? And the narrow investigation would also fail to consider systemic issues. And these can be issues of training, policies become outdated, failure of supervision, failure of inadequate resources. And a good example I can give of this, many are probably familiar with the tragic shooting on the BART station about 11 years ago of Oscar Grant, where an officer claimed he thought he was drawing his taser and instead drew his firearm, fired once, shot Oscar Grant in the back, killing him. At that time, BART police did not have tasers for all officers, so they were sharing them. So they did not have them on their utility belt in the same place where they would develop the muscle memory. So that's an example. If you're going to give officers a piece of equipment, you want to make sure they have the right equipment. You want to make sure they have an opportunity to practice, become accustomed to it before they deploy it in the field. So that's one sort of example of resource investigation. Second characteristic of bad investigation would be the investigator making assumptions about either the complainant, civilian witnesses, witness or subject officers, or situation. And they might draw assumptions based on their own experience, which may be limited and can reflect conscious or unconscious bias. An example I can give for this is I was coming back to my agency from lunch, saw a man standing in the middle of the street fighting an imaginary person in the middle of traffic. About 15 minutes later, he came in to make a complaint. Well, I had observed him in one state of behavior, but that's not the state of behavior he brought to the interview room. He was able to provide a cogent, fairly cogent narrative account. So I had to divest myself of assumptions of maybe this person is mentally ill and treat them as I would any complaint and say, good afternoon, sir. How would you like me to address you? Tell me why you're here and what your concern is. And give that individual an opportunity to tell their story before you make any prejudgment. It's something we all tend to do. We all form quick impressions of people we meet or situations, and you need to be, the investigator needs to be aware of that and hold that in check. And hand in hand with that, potential bias. So this would be unaware of or ignoring personal biases. Perhaps it means you have worked closely with that officer. You went to the academy with him. You have an out-of-work relationship with them. You have a familiar relationship. That you should make your agency, the Internal Affairs Unit, Professional Responsibility Unit supervisor aware of that. And one of the materials that Cami may have sent you is a form that the Oakland Police Department uses in the Internal Affairs Unit that I think is very effective. And for every case they investigate, the internal affairs investigator, who's typically a sergeant, completes that form certifying that they have no potential relationships with the officers under investigation, no personal, no familial, no business relationships. They sign that, and that goes in the case file. And if, for example, they might feel I do have some type of relationship that might influence me, they notify their supervisor of that. That case is assigned to another investigator. It's a good form of quality control. Then the other characteristic of bad investigating will be failing to secure perishable evidence in a timely manner, letting it get stale. So this could be failure to photograph a complainant's injuries while they are still visible, or during a time period when they should still be visible. Now, even if they're not visible during that time, you want to document that. because if there should be bruising there and there isn't, that's an important piece of evidence. So not getting to the complaint in a timely manner, not securing CCTV videos. And I know everyone now feels, well, we have body-worn camera footage, but we have to understand that any video footage only shows the very limited perspective that that camera provides. It does not show everything. It may not show what the officer saw or experienced. So if there's other cameras out there, security cameras mounted on a business or a home, cameras in an ATM machine, there's a wide variety of them that out in public now, and that evidence may be there for a limited period. It could be 96 hours, it could be 10 days, it could be 2 weeks. But if you don't go to the owner of that camera and seek that evidence and you wait too long, it's going to be gone. So that's something very important. You want to get as many videos as you can. And also, in a poor investigation, there would be a failure to interview witnesses who may become unavailable. Maybe they're tourists, maybe they're visiting. They're not going to be in the city for that long, or whose recollections may fade. The more time that passes, the less someone may recollect some incident. So sometimes you want to get to key witnesses early on, get their statements, get them memorialized. Poor investigation is going to be disorganized or unfocused. So that means there may be an inadequate or no investigation plan. Every good internal or administrative investigation should have an investigation plan. We'll talk a little bit about that later when we go over the sample case. And that's a document that's going to evolve. It's going to identify the issues brought forth by the complaint and the allegations, identify the potential evidence, documentary evidence, physical evidence, and human evidence, potential witnesses, and it will evolve as the case goes on. But if you don't have a roadmap, you can't be certain that you're following the right route to get to the destination. Poor documentation of the investigation. You want to have some record of everything that was done that was significant. If you make a phone call attempting to contact someone, that needs to be documented. Again, it's a matter of quality control. It's a matter of establishing a record upon which a finding is going to be based. And then there would be unjustified or unnecessary delays in the investigation. And some cases are going to require a very prompt response. If someone comes in with a complaint that day and says something happened 2 hours ago, there may be witnesses out there that you want to get to very quickly. Whereas if someone comes in 5 or 6 weeks later, well, that may not have the same time critical elements to it. So if there are delays, you want an explanation and they need to be justified. Then we would have poorly done interviews. For every interview, the interviewer should establish rapport with the individual. You treat everyone with the same level of respect. When I would meet a complaint, I greet them, say, "Sir, ma'am, how would you like me to address you?" And I want them to have control. If they say you can call me by my first name, that's fine. When I interviewed an officer, I always referred to them as Officer so-and-so, unless they asked me to refer to them by their first name. Again, you want to show same level of respect, no favoritism, not treating anyone differently. You want to establish rapport to put someone at ease. This is particularly important with complainants, but also with officers as well. Coming in to make a complaint is not something people are familiar with. They're dealing with the bureaucracy. If you're coming into the police agency, you're coming into an agency with people with guns on their hips. And they may be talking about situations that were very emotionally laden for them, that may have involved some trauma. So you want to put someone at ease, explain what's going on, explain the process a little bit, make them feel comfortable. And the same, as I say, can also be true of police officers. We have to recognize that many of their encounters are emotionally laden and may be traumatic, particularly those involving use of force, where they have a resisting suspect, where some significant element of force is used, where someone is injured, where they or another officer may be injured. So you want to do the same sort of rapport building. You want to make it less bureaucratic if you can, staying within professional boundaries, but recognize you're dealing with a human being. You're a human being trying to relate to them in that way. Mentioned you don't want to have differential treatment of civilians and officers. So I mentioned the investigator in a poorly done interview would talk rather than listen. Investigator unnecessarily interrupting. You want to get as much of a free-flowing narrative as you can within reason. If someone is digressing and starting to spend a lot of time talking about past incidents that are not germane to this incident, about things they did that day that may not have relevance, about interjecting a lot of opinions, you want to gently bring them back to the subject at hand, because what you want to get is if possible, a step-by-step narrative chronology of what happened. And that may involve a lot of follow-up questioning, but you want to at least give them that opportunity to make their statement. I found that often what someone who's making a complaint wants is feel heard, feel that someone in a position of authority is going to listen attentively to what they have to say, take it seriously, and give them an ear. And sometimes they just want to have that feeling of being heard and listened to and getting that off their chest. Another hold on, give a poorly done interview with investigator who asks leading or closed questions versus open-ended questions. So leading question would be one that would suggest an answer, or has a very closed-end question, which would be just a yes or no question. So open-end questions are questions that have what, where, how, as opposed to an example of a leading question to an officer might be, did you fear for your safety at that time? That's something you want the officer to volunteer on themselves. A better way of phrasing that was, tell me what was going through your mind as this was going on. That does not suggest any potential answer. Then there'd be a failure to obtain relevant details. Again, you want to go back over the incident with someone and say, okay, you mentioned this. Can you tell me more about that? When you say the officer roughed you up, can you explain that? And you would drill down, okay, which part of your body did the officer make contact with? And how do they make contact with it? And let them provide that information. Was it an open hand? Was it a fist? Was it a foot or knee? All those things may need to be clarified. People, particularly people who are not trained at storytelling, as police officers should be, may give a disjointed account. They may speak in generalizations or abbreviations. They may skip over things. They're focusing on the things that are significant for them. But as an interviewer wants to get all those details, wants to have no gaps. If there are gaps, they want to understand why they're there. Maybe someone wasn't paying attention. Maybe they didn't see that. Maybe they weren't aware of that. Maybe they don't recall that. But you want to, if possible, explain some information, some reason for that gap. And lastly, characteristic of a bad investigation would be poor analysis for the findings. This could be a one-sided or incomplete summary of the evidence. And that's why I talked about documenting the investigation being very important. Now, I don't know whether your agency, your police agency, with a professional responsibility unit, summarizes interviews where they have them transcribed. Transcription obviously is preferable. You can write a summary from that. That way you have the original source document, but all perspectives should be presented when you make that summary and reach a finding. You don't want to leave out significant information. You don't want it to be one-sided. You don't want someone who's going to come in and review it to say, this was relevant and wasn't included in the summary in your analysis. And then there would be a lack of credibility assessments of the complainant, witnesses, and officers. There are clearly established credibility factors in state and federal law. I don't know what they are in Virginia. I'm sure that Gary is familiar with the credibility factors from federal court. I'm not going to go over them here because they're kind of lengthy, but those are something that should be included in every investigation, some assessment of each individual's credibility. So if we can go to the next, before we go to any questions? Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So now we can talk about the good investigation, go from the negative to the positive. So the good investigation is going to have an open, flexible approach, recognizing that there's no one size fits all for every investigation. Obviously, you want to do things consistently, but you have to have some flexibility. You have to have a variety of tools in your toolkit and use the appropriate tool for each task. So this would identify all the possible violations, including those not raised by the complainant, consider possible systemic issues that I mentioned, holding supervisors accountable when warranted. It would be systematic. It would drafts, follows, and updates the investigation plan, identifying the relevant evidence and witnesses as you become aware of new evidence and witnesses as you go on. It's going to identify all of the relevant policies, rules, and training relevant to the officer's actions. And sometimes you want to go beyond the policies. You want to find out how the officer is trained. So you may want to talk to the subject matter expert, the person who does that training at the academy, or who did it when that particular officer went through the academy or went through their most recent continuing education, advanced officer training. So you want to know, what are they being taught? Sometimes you find that may differ from what is in the policy, and that could be an issue of training failure, of not effectively training officers on what the policies are and what standards they're being held to. Many agencies require officers to certify that they've read a policy. Often they will have roll call trainings, but a systematic approach can look at the trainings that are given, the PowerPoint presentations, find out how they're given, do they document attendance, is this information being clearly communicated so all officers understand it? You can't hold an officer accountable for violating a policy if they haven't been adequately trained on it, if they don't know what the standard is. And in some agencies, that has been a failure. They may adopt a policy, but they may not effectively ensure that all officers are thoroughly trained on it. You're going to have clearly document the investigative steps. It's going to be thorough in terms of gathering all the necessary documents and evidence. Now, that's not going to be everything in the entire universe of what's out there, but it's everything that's relevant and addresses an issue or question. And when we talk about our sample case in a little while, I'm going to ask you to identify some of the questions and issues and think about the evidence that would address those questions and issues. And a good investigation in terms of thoroughness has a who would know approach. And who would know is a phrase I got from an investigative reporter named Don Ray. I worked as a journalist many years ago. And the who is very broad. It can be a person, it can be a document, it can be a piece of evidence, a photograph or video. It's something out there that's going to give you a piece of the puzzle, that's going to help you understand what happened. Answer a question, address an issue. So it's that looking at what could be out there that might be useful to me and not having that narrow focus, having the broader focus. And also the thoroughness is going to avoid assumptions about people or evidence. And sometimes that needs to be a conscious process. And the investigator needs to say, am I making a prejudgment? Am I forming opinions too quickly? Am I making assumptions without all the evidence. You know, we're a society where everyone has an opinion, and we're very focused on what's your opinion. Well, a good investigator is going to try and hold their opinion in check until they have all the evidence, much the same way jurors are instructed not to form an opinion until they've heard all the evidence, until they've been instructed by the judge. A good investigator needs to keep reminding themselves of that until they have all the investigations complete, they really can't start forming an opinion, analyzing it, because that can limit how you view things. It can color how you view things, jaundice your focus, and you may start developing some tunnel vision, neglecting to see certain things, and that can lead to an unjustified analysis, potentially an unjustified finding. And excuse me, it's going to be timely. It's going to identify and secure the perishable evidence, such as the injury photographs, the CCTV video, interviewing the witnesses who may become available or whose recollections may fade. The investigators are going to be patient, respectful, and thorough in their interviewing. They're going to recognize the emotional content of the interviews. There's some good trauma-informed training for investigators, and that's something you might want to look into. What training do the internal affairs investigators receive? What potential training might be out there that they would benefit from? Open to all relevant information, meaning not interrupting someone, making sure you get the full picture, active listening, obtaining the narrative account, and using the inverted pyramid format, where you start out very broadly, and then you narrow the focus as you ask follow-up questions, ask for further detailed, clarify things, and at the end you're going to be saying, maybe reviewing things with them, saying, did I get this correctly? You said this, and give them an opportunity to correct if necessary. Clarifying those gaps and inconsistencies. If someone says something at one point and then says something different, you need to ask about that. And it may just be they don't remember things correctly, they may have misspoken, but that's something that can be relevant when you do your analysis, and you want to give someone an opportunity to explain that. If there's an inconsistency between what they have said and other evidence, video, body-worn camera footage, documents, you want to give them an opportunity to potentially explain that and get some understanding about it. You obtain the sufficient details, and you open the door for future contact. At the end of every interview, the interviewer should say, is there anything we haven't discussed that you think I should know? Anything I haven't asked that you think I should have? And then I would always tell people, we've all had the experience that we have a conversation with someone, we go for an interview, half an hour or an hour later, we think, I should have told them X. And that may happen to you. If it does, please get back in touch with me. I want to know that. Open the door for future contact. Say, is it okay if I call you if I have any additional questions? But you also want to make them feel that they're welcome to contact you if they remember something else, if they have some clarification, if they learned something new, if they run into someone who said, I saw what happened, that they will get back to you with that information. And you want to be as open as possible on those things. And then it's going to be unbiased. There's going to be a recognition of potential personal biases, identify real or perceived conflicts of interest to superiors, recusing yourself when required. And I mentioned that Oakland Police Department has that form for which officers can use to recuse themselves. So now we go to the next slide, Cami, and I guess we're going to talk about the sample case I gave you, and I gave you a brief summary of the complaint from complainant Dwayne Johnson and the summary of Officer Rice's police report. So I hope you had an opportunity to review this. This is intentionally more complicated than cases you are likely to be encountering or reviewing. It's deliberately so because I wanted to put a lot of different issues and potential allegations in there. So it's just give a lot of room for inquiry and exploration. So I hope everyone's had a chance to review it. Does anyone need some time, just a minute or two to go through that? No? Okay.
No, I think we should probably give people a couple of minutes if it's okay.
Okay, sure. Yes.
Sure. So it's, yeah. So just 2 minutes. Thanks. Okay, I think that was 2 minutes.
Okay.
Thanks.
This is there where I want to have some audience participation. Before we go on to any questions about so far? Okay, so here we're going to have a practical exam. We're going to talk about what the investigation into this complaint would look like, what are the issues and questions that it raises, and what investigation needs to be done to address those issues and questions. So first we want to look at the legal questions and issues. And can we go to the next slide? So what are the elements of the two criminal offenses here? So we have assault of a police officer, wearing a hat in the theater. So the investigator want to look at what do those statutes say. We're going to look at what is the department rules, what are the department rules on use of force. We have multiple uses of force here. So we would have justification and procedures for use of a taser or electronic control device, for a baton, and for use of a flashlight as weapon. Now, many police agencies prohibit use of a flashlight as a weapon, striking someone with a flashlight, except in very exigent circumstances, such as the officer has been disarmed of the baton, has no other weapon. But typically, these policies may prohibit that use. So you'd want to take a look at that, because that's going to help form the framework for what the standard for behavior of those officers was. Department rules on summoning backup, on reporting and documenting use of force. Is every officer who uses force required to write a report? I would hope so. Is every officer who is present when force is used required to write a report? That's also a very good policy. Department rules on use of profanity, because we'd have an allegation of the officer using profanity. So as you go through the complaint and look at the allegations, the investigator needs to say, what is the applicable rule? And have an understanding of that. So next slide. So then we talk about what are the factual issues and questions. So there's a number of things here. So what happened before the officers got there and had contact with the complainant and his friends? So can anyone think of some of the questions that you would want to have answers to regarding what happened before the officers arrived?
Well, the summary suggests that there had been complaints about noise. I guess you'd want to verify that someone had actually complained about the noise.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very definitely. Anything else? What might have flowed if there had been a complaint about the noise? What other steps in that process might we want to look at?
You would want to check
Oh, go ahead, please.
just what was conveyed both to the complainant by people in the theater and what was conveyed to the police. Who from the theater contacted the police? Was it another patron? Was it somebody from theater management? What was said? What was their articulable suspicion or probable cause? What information did they bring into the theater? And then, the complainant says that no one told him that they were being loud, and you need to verify whether that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important to set the stage for the incident. What did the officers know before they arrived? And that's going to be reflected in the communications record, in the audio recording of the communications, and also on the information that they may get over their mobile video terminal, mobile display terminal in the vehicle. And it may go electronically or may not be an audio broadcast. But when they pull up to that location, what do they know? And that might also involve what they know about that particular theater, or if they're going to a bar, what is their experience with that business in that neighborhood, at that street corner, at that address? Have they been there before? So that's all part of setting the stage, what they know, what their mindset is, but also what interaction took place with the complainant and people in the theater. The complainant is giving one version of what happened. And if you're going to make a credibility assessment, you want to know, well, did someone speak to them? And if so, who? Have they been asked to leave? Did they threaten the theater employees? So that's all some of the questions that you want to have answered. And it's all going to be relevant. So then the characteristics of the incident scene. It's a movie theater. Well, how big is it? Are we talking about a 60-person theater or a theater that holds 300 people with stadium seating? That's going to reflect on sight lines, size, how sound is going to carry there. Is it dark? Is the film going on? What's the ability of individuals to see when they get in there? For the officers to see the complainant as friends, for members of the audience to see the interaction that's taking place between the officers and their friends. What film is being shown? What are the auditory characteristics? You want to know, did they stop the film when the officers came in? And get a sense of which part of the film it was. And that's something you could ask the complainant, you could ask his friends, you could ask witnesses. If it's an action film with a lot of explosions, well, that's going to affect people's ability to hear, or where they're focusing their attention. Another characteristic of the incident would be the officer's equipment and how it was deployed at the time of entry. So a good investigator will ask, what were you wearing? Were you wearing your standard uniform? Were you wearing your duty belt? What was on it? Did you have OC spray? Did you have a taser? Did you have a baton? What type of baton? Was it a wooden baton? Was it an expandable ASC baton? It just kind of sets the stage, so you understand what each party is. It enables you to visualize what's happening as someone describes things. Okay, what about the interaction in the theater? What are some of the things we want to know? What are some of the questions there? Some of the assertions that either the complainant or the officer made, and we want to determine, is this assertion correct? Is it accurate?
Right, two very different stories about what happened, and you just have to drill down and try to make a credibility finding. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's why you want to get answers to a number of things about what was happening. Any thoughts on some of the questions, or some of the issues that you would want to have answered that come from the complainant statement and the officer's report?
Well, the issue about the hat.
Yes.
Which is in the complainant's report. I don't think it's in the officer's report. So yeah, what's the issue with the hat?
Yeah, that's a very good one. That's important. So some of them would be, and again, these are things that an investigator should do. And if you're reviewing an investigation, when you look at a complaint and a police report, you should have in mind, what are the questions that should have been answered here, and were they answered? And if not, why? So one of the things, were in fact the complainant and his friends yelling profanities? Well, other members of the audience can speak to that. The theater manager or anyone who spoke to the complainant and his friends can speak to that. The initial verbal interaction between the complainant and the officers. We have somewhat differing accounts of that. So again, what are you going to see on body-worn camera footage, or more likely hear on the body-worn camera footage, you hope, if it's not drowned out by the sound of the theater? Most body-worn cameras are not great in low-light situations, so you may not be able to see very much. You may have to rely on what witnesses, theater employees, or members of the audience might have to say. We have different accounts of the initial physical interaction between the complainant and the officers. Issues around the force that was used when the complainant was in his seat. The complainant's physical actions while he was seated. Did the officers use profanity to the complainant? That's one of the allegations. Something you can ask other people in the theater. There's probably a policy the police agency has on courtesy or discourtesy, and it may prohibit use of profanity. The complainant's physical movements when he was out of his seat. Was he running? Was he knocked to the ground? How did he get on the ground? The circumstances of the taser use. The element of the officer described as the complainant's attack on the officers. And then the physical actions and statements of the officers. Use of the baton, use of the flashlight, all the physical actions and statements of the complainant. Anyone think of some others based on some of the things I was listing? things you might drill down on. So, for example, the location of the struggle on the floor, how the handcuffing took place, and very importantly, the cause of the injuries, to the lacerations to the complainant's head. Of everything, all the allegations, this may be the most significant because it involves a physical injury, and you have two very different accounts of how that physical injury was sustained. The officer said it was self-sustained when the complainant struck his head against part of the seat, but the officer's actions did not cause that. The complainant is saying that the officer very deliberately struck him in the head with a flashlight. So a couple of important elements there. First of all, the agency may prohibit use of a flashlight as an impact weapon, and most agencies prohibit striking an impact weapon in the head, in certain vulnerable parts of the body. Typically, it's places where it's going to cause pain, the arms, legs, soft tissue, because that's why you're using that pain compliance. The head is not going to be a pain compliance point, a legitimate pain compliance point. You can do a lot of very serious physical injury to someone by striking them in the head. So the cause of those injuries is going to be a really significant issue. Also, the cause of the injury to the complainant's arm. He said this was during the handcuffing. The officers say it was because of the position of his arm when he fell. And then the cause of officers' injuries. How were those sustained? So questions, comments about those dynamics of what happens inside the theater during the encounter with the officers. Okay, then what about actions outside the theater? What do we think might be of interest once they are outside the theater? Okay, well, we have different accounts of the behavior and the statements of the complainant and the officer in the ambulance. So again, we say, who would know? Well, who would know would be the paramedics in that ambulance who were witnesses, any other officers who were near the open ambulance door. You have two accounts, what was said, what they saw, and so those are sources of information. What statements did the complainant or the officers make to the medical personnel? Complainant may have said, they smashed me in the head with a flashlight. Well, that's going to be a consistent statement with what he says in the complaint. But if he said something else, if the medical personnel said, asked him, how did you sustain these cuts to your head? And he said, I don't know. Well, that's going to be inconsistent with what he's saying in his complaint. So what someone says about an incident at various steps of the process, when they're in the ambulance, when they're booked into a jail and are screened by medical personnel, when they're perhaps in a holding cell and talk to other prisoners there, those are all relevant. They're all going to be statements that you can determine are consistent or inconsistent. And that again goes to credibility. Consistency of statements is an important credibility factor. So investigation, thoughts about some of the things we want to look at, the investigator wants to get a hold of that are going to be relevant for this investigation. Kind of based on the things we were talking about earlier. I'm sorry,
I was going to suggest some things that I would look for in an investigation is like training records, disciplinary history of the officers, any other relevant incidents, or even if there have ever been any particular incidents with this particular person.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. The number of errors you would want to look at there. One thing would be, have these officers ever arrested someone for wearing a hat in the theater? have any officers arrested people for wearing a hat in the theater? Is that one of those old 60-year-old statutes on the books that's never been removed and is never enforced, but suddenly it was pulled out here? Or is it enforced perhaps on a particular class of individuals that might have something to do with race, ethnicity, gender? Is it enforced uniformly? The complainant has said other members of that audience were wearing hats. Well, that would be something to look at. What is the officer's histories? Now, again, that may not have relevance as to whether they did or did not commit the actions the complainant claimed in this case, but you do want to see, is there consistency or inconsistency with how they are applying the law and various rules. But things specific to the allegations brought forth by the complainant or that are mentioned by the officer, what are some of the things we would want to gather that would address those the issues raised by the complainant and the officer? Any thoughts on those?
The relevant documentation from basically everybody, you know, including the officers, the medical people. As you said earlier, any of the body-worn camera, all those things that were discussed earlier. I mean, was there anything that anybody in the theater, a management person who has, you know, relevant information prior to the incident?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were saying, medical people, also medical records, complainant's medical records. So to obtain those, the investigator would want the complainant to sign a HIPAA release, because you can't obtain those medical records without that. But obviously we have what documentation was done of those injuries. Were photographs taken as part of perhaps a use of force investigation? Many police agencies require that when there is an injury or someone complains of an injury, that a supervisor will respond and conduct an on-the-scene use of force investigation, which may include photographing injuries to the complainant, injuries to officers, taking witness statements, ensuring that all officers who are present write reports, and ensuring that those reports are submitted before the end of the shift and approved by a supervisor. Are photographs taken of the officers' injuries? Is there other documentation in terms of their personnel records? In other words, what documents would shed light on whether you can prove or disprove any elements of what the complainant said or what the officer said? And then some other things. So one of the factors you look at in use of force incidents, the U.S. Supreme Court has set these out in a well-known case, Graham v. Connor, things like the comparative size and strength of the officers and the complainant. So are these officers each large, very strong people, or are they small? How do they compare in size to the complainant? Height, weight, physical condition. So age, training may all be relevant to that. The tenure, training, and prior experience, let's say, of Officer Rice. Is Officer Rice a very experienced officer who's made numerous arrests? Is he someone who previously taught at the academy in control holds and use of force? Or is he a fairly new officer who maybe has not made a lot of arrests? What is the complaint history and similar, as you mentioned, similar incidents involving Officer Rice or Peterson? The complainant's medical history of injuries. So he's claiming that there's an injury to his arm. Well, did he have a pre-existing injury to that arm that might have made it more susceptible to re-injury? And these are things that subject matter expert here might be a physician, It might be in San Francisco, we would often take medical records to the medical examiner and show them photographs, and they could give an opinion on whether this injury is or is not consistent with a certain cause. Would it be consistent with making contact with a floor? Would it be consistent with being struck with an impact weapon, such as a flashlight? That's all going to be very relevant evidence for when you analyze, do an analysis and reach a finding. So I think the next slide is going to talk about potential allegations raised by the investigation. I guess not. So what are some of the allegations? Officer Rice ordering the complainant to remove his hat. Officer Rice telling him to show her some respect. Selectively enforcing the no hats law. The arrest of the complainant, was that justified? The force used by the officers, and again, you want to break down each specific use of force. There's the grabbing the complainant's arm and trying to take him out of his seat. Use of the taser is a very separate set of force that may have different elements of the use of force policy applying to it. The striking the complainant in the head with a club, flashlight, or other impact weapon. The injury to the complainant's arm, was that control hold when he was handcuffed appropriate? Was it in compliance with department policy and training? Should the officers have been using profanity? Was that a violation of department policies? And the threat to the complainant in the audience, I'm sorry, in the ambulance, would likely be a violation of one department policy. So it's important to go through all the things the complainant has said, identify the policy that applies, and make sure you have all the allegations listed. And those would all be in the investigation plan. So let's now look at the investigation plan for this case. So we talked about the police communication records, what the officers knew when they arrived, the audio recording of what they were told by dispatch, any communications they made, not just officers, the responding officers, Officers Peters and Rice, but officers who responded as backup. And here you have a call for backup. Now, was that, the audio of that can be very relevant. If the officer's voice sounds very panicked, out of breath, as though they're engaged in a struggle, that's going to reflect one way on what was happening there. However, if it's calmer, more relaxed, that's going to reflect a different type of potential situation that's going on at the time they ask for backup. Obviously, the written statements that any of the officers prepared, you want to see when they were prepared, how close in time to the incident were they. Typically, they should be prepared before the end of the shift. You also want to look at, were they approved by a supervisor, and when were they approved? Any use of force reports, either by those officers or by a supervisor. Any incident report prepared by the theater. If there's an incident in that theater, are they required to prepare an internal report? If the police are summoned, are they required to prepare an internal report? They may have a narrative account from whoever had an interaction with a complainant and his friends, possibly giving them a warning, who may have been present when the police were there, who may have accompanied the police into the theater and may have witnessed that. So that's going to be an important document to obtain. Names and contact information for audience members. Any ideas how we could get those? Sure, people went to movie theaters, certainly before the pandemic, but think about how you might have paid for your ticket. Maybe you bought it online in advance using a credit card. Maybe you bought it through Fandango. Maybe it was a theater chain and you're a member of that chain's frequent attendee club and you get a discount. So those are all potential ways to potentially identify people who were in the audience. Obviously, if someone paid cash, that's going to be much more difficult. But again, it's a matter of thinking, who would know? How you could potentially identify someone who may have been an important witness to this, and clearly you have some very different accounts between the complainant and the officers. So civilian witnesses are going to be very important if you don't have some dispositive evidence from body-worn camera footage. Complainant said one of the audience members said they were filming with their cell phone. Well, typically cell phones have worked better in low light than body-worn cameras do. So they may have captured more. So if some member of the audience was filming with their phone, that would be really valuable evidence to get a hold of. The ambulance dispatch and incident records, those will typically be different from the police records. And again, you want to know what information that the paramedics have, what were they told about the incident they were responding to, when did they arrive, when did they leave, when did they arrive at wherever they were transporting the individual, if they transported them to. Was it to the jail, was it to the hospital? Most jails require that if someone has an injury, they be cleared by medical before they can be admitted to the jail. So often that's going to involve taking someone to a hospital for treatment or evaluation. If someone had a head injury, they would might want to have done x-rays to look for any potential internal injuries before they clear them. As I mentioned, the complainant's medical records, and not just the ambulance, but the hospital records. Jail medical records are going to be separate. Medical records for any subsequent treatment they receive. So when the investigator interviews the complainant, you want to ask, who did you see about these injuries when you got out of jail, or did you see anyone? What are their name? Where are they? What was the date? Will you sign a release for those records? The citations prepared by Officer Rice, prisoner transfer records. Can you want to see when, where, who, what? Were they transported with someone who they might have made statements to, who might have observed their physical condition? The booking documents, sometimes they will have a photograph of the individual attached to those, inventory of property, mugshots or other photographs taken by the police or jail staff. Again, those are all going to be relevant for potentially documenting injuries, showing what the individual looked like at the time of their arrest. Next slide. Mentioned photographs of the officer injuries. Someone mentioned officer training records. That's going to be very relevant. How more recently did they receive advanced officer training that might have covered things like use of impact weapon, use of a taser, department policies? If that training was very recent, then it's going to be harder for that officer to say, I wasn't really familiar with the policy. But if that training was far in the past, that's also going to be a factor that may be considered. In Oakland, when a case is sustained before discipline is imposed, there's a document prepared that lists mitigating and aggravating factors that will work towards elevating or diminishing the range of discipline for that particular offense. So aggravating the factors would be, let's say, an officer's experience, recent training, level of responsibility, past history of violations. Mitigating factors might be lack of experience, lack of training, inexperience with a certain situation, no prior record of disciplinary action, commendations, things like that. So those records can be very relevant at one point of the investigation. Records of that officer's previous taser discharges. How often are they discharging a taser? And do those discharges, are they in compliance? If that officer previously had several improper discharges of their taser and had been counseled or trained on it, again, that's not just going to be an aggravating factor, but that's going to be something you're going to ask them about, saying, have you had prior experience? What did you learn from that? Were you familiar with the policy? why is there repetition of this behavior? Dispatch records of police responses to that theater. Are they coming out frequently to noise complaints? Are they making arrests for people wearing hats in that theater? Do they have a particular view of that theater? Do they feel it's a theater where there are troublemakers, where they have a lot of problems, where they've gotten into physical encounters with people? Or is it someplace that they never respond to, where police response is very infrequent? As we mentioned, records of arrest for wearing a hat in the theater, records of the arrest by those officers, records of arrest by those officers for assault on an officer and or resisting arrest. Again, it may not have limited relevance to determining whether this incident, these allegations are true or not. But if an officer has repeatedly made arrests for resisting that have been dismissed because they were not valid, that's something management may want to consider, and that the investigator may want to note somewhere for whoever is going to make a decision on how this matter will be remediated. And that, again, that could involve discipline, training, counseling, a variety of outcomes. And next slide, I think. So some of the physical evidence, again, we talked about documentation of injuries. Obviously, the body-worn camera recordings, those are one of the first things you're going to look at because they may have some very relevant evidence that could potentially very quickly elevate this to a criminal investigation. If you look at the body-worn camera footage and you can clearly see that the officer struck the complainant in the head with an object, that he did not sustain those injuries from falling and hitting his head against the theater seat, well, now you have a potential criminal case for assault under color of authority, for potentially lying in a report. The criminal investigation is likely to take precedence over the administrative investigation, particularly because information can flow only one way. It can flow from the criminal investigation to the administrative investigation, but not the other way. Because in an administrative investigation, officers can be compelled to give a statement. They cannot be compelled to give a statement in the criminal investigation because of their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So when an officer makes a statement in an administrative investigation under threat of discipline, that evidence cannot be used against them in a criminal case. It should never go to the criminal investigation because that can taint the entire investigation, lead to any charges being thrown out. So that's why the criminal investigation is likely to take place first, the administrative investigation later on. So every agency has their own protocol about that. The CCTV footage from any cameras inside or outside the theater. And again, you want to be able to look at this incident as you would a film. Any documentation you can have that can prove or disprove any element of what either the complainant says, what witnesses say, what the officers say. Is it accurate? Is it truthful? Is it documented? Or is it contradicted by other evidence? And CCTV footage is going to be a very valuable form of evidence. You would want to get photographs of the clothing the complainant wore at the time. Are there bloodstains on that clothing? When you're interviewing witnesses, you may want to ask, they may identify someone by the clothing. I remember the guy in the striped shirt. I remember the guy with the blue hat. It may have been dark. That may be what they saw. People often have a clear recollection of what clothing someone was wearing than of more facial features. I mentioned any cell phone video from anyone in the audience. If you want to look at that officer's flashlight, and potentially they might want to confiscate that if this is serious enough, and see, is there blood on that flashlight? Is there DNA? Because again, if there's criminal liability there and the complainant's blood or DNA is on that flashlight, that's going to be very significant evidence in what's likely to be a felony charge against that officer for assault. Also, photographs of the theater, particularly detailed photographs of the area where the complainant and his friends were seated, and of those seats, and of the area where that seat joins the floor where the officer said the complainant struck his head, causing those injuries. And again, you want to get that evidence fairly quickly. You cannot guarantee that a few weeks or a few months down the line, those seats may have been replaced. They could have been damaged, and once that evidence is gone, it's going to be gone for good. Next slide, please. And any questions about any of the physical evidence I've been talking about?
One other thing I'd add, which can be useful depending on the circumstances, is, and I think you mentioned it, but the cell phones, you referenced the photographs, but text messages from the complainants and potentially cell phones of the officers.
Yes.
For text messages, witness what we're just saying with Secret Service text messages.
Oh yes.
But both, text message, you can text while you're watching a movie, and potentially complainant could be texting about facts relevant to the lead up. I doubt they're texting while the incident is going on, but anyway, just another thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that also goes to social media. People could be posting contemporaneously to social media. Members of the audience might be posting to social media. I just saw police brutalize this guy in a movie theater while I was watching so-and-so. So you would want to do potentially a check of social media, but you'd want to ask the complainant and his friends, were you communicating with anyone close in time to this while it was going on? Did you call anyone? Did you text anyone? Immediately after it happened, did you text the complainant's parents or friends or anyone to tell them what happened? Because again, those are going to be contemporaneous statements. If the officers are using department-issued cell phones, you have a right to access call records and text messages. In San Francisco, we had a very significant scandal involving officers exchanging horrendously racist text messages. Not on department cell phones, on personal cell phones. This came to light because of federal prosecution of some officers. And these were things along the lines of, let's burn a cross on these people's lawns. Really outrageous statements. But yes, officers could have been texting others immediately afterwards during the response there. They can also be exchanging messages on their mobile video terminal. So I'll be saying, oh, the backup officers or the officers Rice and Peters could be texting other officers like, oh, we're going to X theater, and they might make some very derogatory comment about the patrons of that theater that might reflect on race, ethnicity, other protected categories. These things do happen. If you don't look for it, you're not going to find it, but that could disclose some much more serious systemic issues there. So the investigator would want to potentially look for all of those things. So as you're reviewing investigations, you may want to ask, how are these records kept? Did you access them? Can you access them? What do they look like? I don't know if as part of your training you've done any ride-alongs. I found that one of the best way to understand police procedures and how things operate in the field. Ask them questions about the mobile terminal. How do you do that? What does that mean? Where is that recorded? How is it saved? What are these documents you're completing? What are they called? Can I get a blank copy of them? So you have an understanding of the chain of documentation, both hard copy and electronic. So you know what someone potentially could be looking at, that's going to fill in the understanding of what happened. Every investigation, every interaction, it's like a film, and you want to be able to make sure you see it from as many angles as possible, that you're able to slow it down. And sometimes you're not going to have enough information to get all those angles, get all those scenes, but If possible, you want to know what's there, and if you can. And the more serious the complaint, the more serious the allegations, the more important those things are going to become. And again, this sample complaint had a lot in there. It had some serious allegations, but even if it didn't have the use of force, the injuries to the head and the arm, you'd still have use of a taser. Was that warranted? Many law enforcement agencies will only allow use of a taser in a situation where deadly force might be allowed, where they might have an escalating use of force ladder. You don't have to go step by step, but you can't just jump to something like a taser without trying some other steps. So that would be something to look at. Witnesses to interview. Obviously, complainant's two companions, they're closest in proximity. They're going to be able to give you a sense of what happened before. They observed the interaction with the police, what happened to them afterwards, in a whole range of things. That's going to be a lengthy interview. Obviously, they may have a particular interest because they know the complainant, but you want to explore that, and you want to see what they have to say, separate out their opinions from their clear observations. You also want to ask them, who did you talk about with this close in time? Again, did you text anyone? Did you call anyone? Who were the first people you talked to about this? Those contemporaneous statements can be very important. When I did EEO investigations, particularly in sexual harassment investigations, where they're often one-on-one, you didn't have any witnesses, but the person the individual was claiming harassment talked to close in time could be very valuable, because they could talk about what the person told them and also their emotional state. So if these two friends call someone and they're really panicked and they're saying, I can't believe they smashed him in the head, blood was running down his face, that's going to be very relevant, the nature of those communications. So obviously the theater manager, what they observed, what they told the police, they're going to have some information on how often police respond to that theater. They're going to know, do they make complaints to police about people wearing hats? Do police take action about that? Or is that something that's very rare that they've never heard of before? The theater employee who had contact with the complainant and his companions. We talked about audience members, potentially the projectionist. Now, it may be a high-tech theater where that's remote controlled, but there may have been someone in that booth who was hearing or potentially seeing something that's there. So again, you don't want to rule out anyone. You're thinking, who would know? Who potentially could have been there? The paramedics, the medical personnel who examined and treated the complainant. They may not have the expertise to say how that injury was caused, but the statements the complainant made to them, or statements the officer made to them about the force that was used, or about how the injury was sustained, is relevant. Jail personnel who took custody of the complainant. Again, any statements made, any observations. One thing we haven't mentioned is you always want to ask people, and usually I would ask them this at the end of the interview, because they may become a little defensive about it, was, did you have anything to drink? Had you taken any medications or drugs? Anything that might have affected their perceptions, their recollection? It could be alcohol. It could be cold medication. If someone suffers from migraine headaches, there's certain migraine medications that can make you kind of sleepy. Or if you're experiencing a migraine headache, that's going to affect your ability to perceive some things and how you're going to focus your attention. So you always want to ask those sort of things at the end, because a good investigator is going to think, if we sustain a complaint, if we reach a definitive finding, what could someone on the opposite side, what could someone questioning the findings, the officer's representative or attorney, or if this goes to a lawsuit, the complainant's attorney, what questions could they ask that I haven't asked, where they're going to have come up with an answer that's something we really should have known. Where I want to make sure we have a very complete roadmap here. And so other investigation next, which is on the next slide, we talked about that a little. The social media, postings about the incident, postings about these officers, postings by these officers. And again, that's drilling down quite a bit, but in this racist text scandal, we also had something similar in Oakland. They looked at officers' postings on social media sites, and you want to see, are they posting things there that are really inappropriate, that are racist, that are maybe bragging about force they've used? These things are not unheard of in a community outside San Francisco and Vallejo that found that officers who were involved in shootings were bending the points of their star to symbolize the fact that they had shot someone while on duty, something that might be, many people would be considered very inappropriate. Also, YouTube postings of videos. Someone can very immediately, or any of the also social media sites, that person filming with their cell phone could very quickly upload it to social media. So those are things that potentially could be looked at. Again, may not happen in every case, but as you're reviewing an investigation, it's important for you to know all the areas that the investigator could be looking at. Doesn't mean they needed to do it in every case, but you want to be able to say, was it done? Should it have been done? If it wasn't done, why wasn't it done? So I think, were we talking about taking a break about now? Or, oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
Jason, if you want to do this one last slide, then we're at a great natural breaking point.
Okay. Yeah, so I always like to put together a matrix comparing what the different parties said about different elements of the incident. So here we identify some of the significant issues on the top. So in the third column over, were the complainant and his friends yelling or using profanities? What do people say about that? Were others in the audience wearing hats, as the complainant claims? Did the complainant punch or kick the officers? Something the officers claim. Next column, how were the injuries caused to the complainant's head? So those are some of the really significant. Then you go down on the leftmost column, what each individual had to say. The complainant's three companions, actually, the manager, and then you have 3 witnesses, and then you have what's seen on a cell phone video. So you're going to see here, you're going to see some consistencies and some inconsistencies. But I often use this as the framework for writing up the summary. And it's a good way to see, okay, what does the evidence show here? Putting on the significant issues. So one column from the right, the injuries to the complainant's head. So you see friend number 2 says the officer smashed the complainant in the head 20 to 30 times. Well, unlikely that it happened 20 to 30 times. It's not unusual for someone to overestimate the number of blows delivered because something's happening quickly. They're focusing on the intensity of what's happening. But the fact is they say, okay, this did happen. He did strike him in the head. Then we have the manager. Again, because of the lighting conditions, he saw the flashlight beam jerking back and forth quickly. And that's circumstantial evidence that the flashlight was being moved back and forth in a manner that would be consistent with the complainant being struck in the head. Witness number 2 said he sees the officer raise his arm up and bring it down fast. Again, that would be consistent with the officer striking the complainant with the flashlight. And then the video shows the flashlight beam going up and down. Again, it doesn't capture the flashlight striking the head. It's circumstantial evidence, but that would be very important. So putting things in this kind of graphic sort of matrix allows you to compare, allows someone who's reviewing it to take a look at this. And obviously, everything that's in this matrix has to come from those statements, has to come either from the transcript or the summary of the witness interview. It has to be documented there. It has to be supported. This is just an abbreviation of it, but it's a very useful tool for contrasting what different people saw and getting a quick look at the evidence. So before we take a break, any questions?
I'm going to take that as a no. But before I take a break, I just wanted to mention how interesting I found all of this, and arresting somebody for wearing a hat in a movie theater is going to stick with me for a long time. Anyway, so I will entertain a motion to stand at recess until 7:15. If anybody wants to make that motion.
I move we stand in recess till 7:15.
Great. Anybody want a second?
I'll second the motion.
Great. All in favor, say aye.
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 Great. All opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Nope. Great. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and be back at 7:15. Thanks. Okay, everybody. I know that was a short 10 minutes, but we are back. So I just wanted to remind, if I could just take 30 seconds to remind these COB members that we need to approve some meeting minutes after the training. So please don't log off as soon as the training is concluded, because we've got to do that. A reminder that sadly, the last NACOLE training is next Tuesday, I believe, August 2nd. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And reminder also that all the materials for the trainings, when you need to see them, are sent to your Arlington County email addresses. So if you're wondering where the case study was, that's where it was. So please be certain to check your emails regularly, and certainly prior to any of our meetings, in case there's any information that we're sharing. Anyway, apologies for taking an extra minute on that, and please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, Jason?
So now we're going to talk about the specifics of reviewing a complaint investigation, which is what you'll be doing, and we'll be reviewing some of the things, but giving some more detailed examples of what you should be looking for. So the first slide, or the next slide rather. So we're going to talk about the complaint and interview. So we talked about letting the complainant tell their story with minimal interruption, asking appropriate open-ended and clarifying questions, getting all the relevant information. So this is going to include contact information for witnesses, descriptions of each officer and their actions. And sometimes they're going to you're not going to know officer names. They might say the tall officer, or the officer with the red hair, but you want to go through it and make sure you get everything they say about that particular officer, what they did, where they were, what they said. All documentation of the incident and the injuries. And this is going to include how they came into contact with the officers. In other words, what was going on. Again, that setting of the stage, any injuries they had, getting the medical release, the closing questions about anything else you remember, anything else should have asked. Who have you discussed this with anyone else? We mentioned that a little bit. Who did you talk to, or did you communicate with, electronically or otherwise? When? What was the summary of what was said? And those closing questions, anything we haven't discussed yet, contact me if you remember something. The investigator assignment. Was the investigator handling the complaint free of potential bias? And I think that's the next slide. Free of potential bias due to family relationship, personal friendship, romantic relationship, outside business relationship, close work relationship with the officers who are the subject of the investigation. And again, in a smaller police agency, that can be a little difficult, but it's something that you need to be aware of. It could come up to haunt you later on. If you can get someone who does not have that bias to do the investigation, that's always preferable. Was the lack of potential bias documented in the file in the type of form I mentioned that I think Cami will be sending you or has sent you? Did the investigator have adequate time and resources to conduct the investigation? For really any professional task, there's a standard of care of what is appropriate to deliver that type of service to a particular customer, whether it's in accounting field, engineering, medicine, law enforcement, internal investigations. Does the investigator have enough time to do this? Do they have the resources? Can they get out to the scene? Do they have the cameras to document evidence? are they so overwhelmed with work that they are not going to be able to do a good job? Are they assigned a case that we're going to require some immediate investigation 2 days before they're going on a 3-week vacation, meaning nothing is going to happen for 3 weeks? Perhaps someone else should have gotten that investigation, or someone else should have filled in to perform those immediate tasks until that officer got back. Did they have the necessary equipment? If they needed additional officers, let's say to conduct a canvass of an incident, perhaps in an area where there's a lot of people with multi-family, multi-unit dwellings, you're going to need to knock on a lot of doors in a short period of time. Are they going to be able to get other officers who can assist with doing that canvass in a timely manner at the same time that the incident occurred, when people are who would have been home then are likely to be home, or when people were at work were likely to be at work? The investigation plan, did it list all the relevant allegations and the relevant policies? The allegations raised by the complainant, additional allegations not raised by the complainant, were supervisory officers held accountable for the actions of their subordinates. And I once investigated a case where officers had an unauthorized ride-along with them. Now, in most jurisdictions, I guess in all, someone doing a ride-along has to sign some documents. It has a release form. The watch commander needs to know that ride-along is there. In this case, these officers had an undocumented ride-along, and they did some things that were, shall we say, very far beyond what the rules allowed. They responded to a noisy party, and they spent about 40 minutes there having snacks, chatting with people. When the party ended, they gave 4 of the women there a ride to a bar, cramming them into the back seat of the police car. When one of the women asked about the mobile terminal, the officer said, "Let me show you. What's your driver's license number?" and ran her driving record. So that told me that these officers weren't particularly worried about their supervisor catching them engaging in multiple violations of department policy. Why was that? That was something that could and should have been explored. Were the supervisors aware of this? Would they just not care? Why did officers, if officers engaging in a certain level of misconduct, why did they feel comfortable doing that? And what is happening with supervisory authority there and monitoring? Did the plan identify all the relevant records, evidence, witnesses, and investigative tasks? Did it include a timeline for completion of those tasks that was realistic? Was that adhered to? Was the plan approved and reviewed by a supervisor? Were the records and evidence obtained and documented in a timely manner, showing when you requested it, when you received it, when you reviewed it, what the summary of that document and evidence was? Were failures to obtain documents or evidence or conduct interviews explained? In other words, an officer was on leave, you couldn't interview him, or you requested a document, they never responded, you followed up multiple times, you got no response. You can't just say, we asked for something once and then never followed up. Good investigators always want to say, why haven't I gotten this? Maybe someone didn't get my previous email. Maybe they didn't act on it. Maybe they need to be reminded. Were there gaps that were documented and explained? Was an officer called away on a very more serious investigation, an officer involved shooting, where resources have to be allocated to some other tasks? So there needs to be some explanation in the record. So if you see a 2 or 3 month gap in the investigation, you can have some understanding of why that happened. And the next slide, I mentioned were the relevant records requested and obtained. Are there relevant evidence that should be obtained, such as the police report, arrest reports, written and recorded statements of witnesses or officers, the body-worn camera footage, not just of the officers who were the subjects of the interview, but any witness officers, any other officers at the scene. Is that cataloged? Is it looked at? What, if anything, did it capture? Even if it didn't capture the moment of the incident, it might have captured statements by any of the parties afterwards. That might be very relevant to what happened, expressions of opinion or statements about what happened. Stop data forms. Many agencies require officers, when they do a vehicle stop or a detention of a pedestrian, to complete stop data form, a computerized form documenting the time, location, date of the incident, the race or ethnicity of the individual, their sex, the reason for the stop, whether a search took place and what the results of that search were. And those statistics can become important in looking at issues of biased policing. Are people of a particular race or ethnicity being disproportionately stopped? Are they being disproportionately searched? And what are the results of those searches? Those can be very relevant for looking at patterns of behavior. The computer-assisted dispatch records, messages sent on a mobile display terminal, text messages, use of force reports and photographs. The jail records may be totally separate from that law enforcement agency, typically run by the county sheriff. Arrestee property inventory records and receipts. Prisoner transfer logs, going to tell you who was transported with an individual, who may have observed their condition, to whom they may have made statements. Consent to search forms can be very important, documenting that someone did in fact give consent to a search. Some jurisdictions require that someone actually sign a form, that they that it's confirmed that they understand what they're signing. That if English is not their first language, that form be in their first language, or that someone translated for them. Things like field interview cards, mug shots, mention an officer's complaint history. Next slide. So interviews, what is the policy your agency has on recording audio or video recording interviews? And was that standard applied consistently? If it says that all civilian interviews shall be recorded, were they? Typically in California, I don't know what the law is in Virginia. California is a two-party consent state. You cannot audio record what's considered a confidential conversation without the consent of both parties. Same would be true of a telephone conversation. I'm not sure what the law is in Virginia, but if the process is to record them, are they all recorded? Is there a pre-recording conversation that was not captured? And this is often an issue in officer interviews. Do they talk for 5 or 10 minutes that's not recorded? And what is said in that pre-recording interaction? The implication is that the officer can be given some information. The investigator may be discussing the case with them in a way that indicates some bias. So all of those things need to be, needs to be some consistency there. For civilian witnesses, was there a due diligence to exercise to locate witnesses by checking records that they're going to give you a way to contact them? Phone numbers, email addresses, physical addresses. These would be things like Department of Motor Vehicle records, voter registration, online searches and social media, court and property records, police and criminal justice databases. Again, what are your due diligence standards? In some agencies, it's going to be 3 attempts to contact a witness by different means, maybe letter, phone, email, a variety of those. Have you confirmed that that is the correct email address or the correct phone number? Is that the correct physical address? And again, the more serious the investigation, the more important it is going to be that you make affirmative attempts to contact those witnesses. Were canvasses for witnesses conducted? Was the canvass done in a timely manner? Was it properly documented? And it should be properly documented for every address, every door that's knocked on. There's some documentation of whether there was no answer, whether there was no one home, who you talked to, what, if anything, they observed or heard. And if they say they heard nothing, that's going to be important, because if later on that individual gives a statement to the press saying, I saw X and Y and Z, and you have had some documentation that they told the person conducting the canvass that they did not see anything. The canvasser should also ask, who else is in this, who else is in the household? Who else lives here? Is it possible they may have seen something, and possibly doing follow-ups, calling to see if that person did in fact see someone? If you have multiple people in the household, the person who answers the door may not be in position to say what other members of the household did or did not see or hear regarding that incident, or what they might have heard from others who, neighbors who may have observed something. Were the interviews thorough? Again, was the complete narrative elicited? Open-ended clarifying questions? All the relevant evidence obtained and inconsistencies addressed? The officer interviews, were they conducted in conformance with your jurisdiction's officers' rights and responsibilities? They're going to be both the state law regarding officer interviews and your law enforcement agency's policy, which is typically require officers to answer truthfully and completely in an administrative investigation. If they withhold information, if they lie, if they refuse to answer, that they would be subject to discipline, that in fact is explained to them, and that if they fail to answer questions asked of them, that appropriate remedial action is taken. Were officers asked about their training and experience? Again, this can be very relevant, because you're going to judge an officer who has some specialized experience, veteran officer, very differently than you might an officer who is fairly new. And a good example I can give of this, I interviewed an officer of lengthy experience who had been on the equivalent of our SWAT team, had dealt with a lot of high-risk situations, in, searches, confrontations with people with weapons. I'd asked him about his training, the screening for that, about officers being able to handle those stressful situations appropriately. And that became relevant because he said that he failed to remember some very relevant facts, relevant elements of that encounter, which were captured on a cell phone video, because of the stress of taking a knife off someone's belt. And that therefore he did not, that was why he had given me a story that contradicted what was on the video, because of the stress. Well, I was able to say, but you did tell me that you had in fact worked in stressful situations, had been screened for that. So that kind of undercut his claim that the stress of that very minor, dealing with that comparatively minor seizure of a weapon, was going to affect his ability to perceive and recall that incident. So that's why you want to ask those about the training and experience and specialized assignments. You want to ask about their understanding of relevant policies and rules. So you can say, what is your understanding of the rule regarding, let's say, use of a taser? When are you allowed to use a taser? See what is their understanding consistent with what the training is, with what the policy is? And if they don't have a clear understanding, why is that? Is it due to poor training, the fact that they haven't read the policy? What gaps might be there? Make sure that there are no leading and suggestive questions where they ask to describe actions very specifically. And again, if an officer says someone took a fighting stance, describe that. What was the position of their body? Where were their hands? Where were their feet? How were they positioned in relation to you? Not accepting kind of generic, conclusory descriptions of things, but getting down to the very nitty-gritty the elements of that, of a statement that's kind of conclusory. Show me what happened, and you might want to ask them to demonstrate it. Were any inconsistencies addressed? And then the report. And I think that's the next slide. Was all the relevant evidence summarized? This doesn't mean all the evidence, doesn't mean every single detail, but everything that's relevant to the allegations, to the significant issues here. Were all the allegations addressed? Were all the relevant policies and rules cited in that report, either verbatim or referred to those specific rules that might be an attachment to the report? Did the investigator gather enough sufficient relevant evidence, including the direct evidence, physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, to allow for supportable and reasoned finding based on your standard of evidence? In most places, it's going to be preponderance of the evidence. That's going to be more likely than not. Some cases, it's clear and convincing evidence. I'm not going to go into the legal definitions of those, but those are something that your agency should be able to define for you. Did the investigator make credibility assessments based on established credibility factors, based on law that may be in your state's jury instructions and federal jury instructions? Those list those factors in easy to understand language for lay people. And all of your internal investigators should be familiar with those, should be making those credibility assessments. If they're not, you should be asking why, because those are standard in administrative investigations. Did the investigator analyze all the evidence and testimony? And did the address and reconcile inconsistencies in the evidence? Did the evidence support the findings? And if your standard of proof was preponderance of the evidence, was that applied? Was there something saying, and this is why we have sufficient evidence to provide a preponderance of the evidence proving or disproving this particular allegation? In other words, are they applying the facts of the law? And the law is that standard of evidence and that rule or policy in the agency. So, questions about this, or comments, or thoughts?
It's very helpful and very thorough. You know, some of the questions I have are more specific to how we as a COB in Arlington will work. So they're not necessarily things that you can answer, but I certainly appreciate, I should turn on my camera, certainly appreciate, oops, wow, there we go. All the detail that you went through. And, you know, I mean, it's just an interesting endeavor, right? To uncover the facts and to learn what happened. So I'm, you know, interested and excited to move forward with it. So really only a comment, which is really helpful, and thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, thank you.
Hello, this is Gary Dean. I am the vice chair of the COB. Thank you so much, as Lisa and everybody, I'm sure, are learning a lot here. So going back to the second half after the break, I want to just ask one question about bias. I know bias is a very difficult topic, but I think what I picked up, and I want to make sure that I picked this up correct, in those areas, whether it's their investigation or ours, where we suspect that, you mentioned kind of things that to me appear more the obvious things. And is that the level that you're basically talking about? Because since it is such a difficult topic, for example, you used, you know, girlfriends, you know, things that are like, you don't even have to look for them. Basically, they're almost there, but you do need, I mean, is that is that basically from our level as a COB, as you look at us, we're looking at best practices, just on that particular topic, is that kind of the lens that you suggest that we use, or I call them the obvious things that you really don't have to really look for them, they're just there. Can you comment on that first? And then I have one other question about witness testimony.
Sure, and I have a question for you. How large is your police agency? Roughly how many officers?
I think it's like 270 or 300. I mean,
Okay.
they're down. I think full is 320, but they're down to like 270, I think.
Okay, so it might be difficult for internal affairs, professionals, responsibility officers to not know officers. You would not want someone investigating someone who had been their partner, who they worked closely with, who had been their field training officer. But in a department that small, it will be difficult to maybe have an investigator who can say, I have never had any contact with this individual. But you really want to look at it, and that individual should evaluate whether they feel they can judge it, that person in an unbiased manner. Do they know something about that person? Do they, I don't know, they on an opposing sports team, a fan of the opposing sports team? That's just going to have them, the same kind of questions you might ask a juror. That would make it difficult for you to evaluate these facts fairly. So it is kind of obvious. One thing I train people on is that, and I'm talking about oversight investigators, but I think this would also apply to a lot of police officers. We're probably middle class. We probably have not had the sort of experiences many of the people who might be making complaints with us have had with police, or that their friends or community members have had. So our sense of what is plausible or implausible regarding police actions may be different from complaints perspectives. So for example, before George Floyd, a lot of people might have said, it wouldn't be plausible that an officer would keep his knee on someone's neck for 7 minutes. They wouldn't be stupid enough to do that. But the video showed that happened. That those things like that have happened, and videos have shown us that things we might, middle-class people, particularly white people, might have thought were implausible, have in fact happened. So you need to keep that in mind when you interview a complainant, when you evaluate their statement, about your lens of what you think could be plausible or not, and keep that in check, both in how you communicate with them, how you respond to them consciously or unconsciously, because we communicate a lot unconsciously, non-verbally, but in how you view those things. And recognize that we all have our own set of life experiences. And for the most part, if you are an oversight investigator or if you are a police officer, you're probably leading a middle-class lifestyle. That many of the people who file complaints against police may not be middle class, may not have had the same experiences with police that you or your friends or your relatives have had, and just being aware of that. So that may have gone a little beyond your question.
Yeah.
But
no, that's okay. That's really good. I appreciate you taking it just one step further. And I guess just for time, I'm not going to ask a question. I'll just make a comment. Many of us have, in past jobs, have had training in witnesses, the reliability of witnesses. And so this case was really good because you had a he said, she said thing. And what I really liked, one of the biggest takeaway with me of that part, was that matrix piece that really kind of how you puts this together kind of on a, all this stuff. And then this affinity thing, I really like that process that you laid out because, in a prior life, I was an aircraft accident investigator. You ask 20 people what happened and, you get 20 different answers. So that piece of this where you talked about this matrix really kind of hit home with me. And I just want to comment, very, very good. If that's a best practice that I hope that's something we can adopt, but thank you.
And I imagine your previous experience would be very helpful, kind of the idea of failure analysis. Why did this happen? How can it be prevented in the future? Which, again, talking about systemic issues from a management perspective, saying what caused this to happen and how are we going to prevent it from happening in the future by making changes to training or policy or equipment or resources. Because you have to look at every complaint as customer dissatisfaction. Members of the public are your customers, and if they're making a complaint, well, it may be justified or not, but you want to have good customer relations because that's the community you're serving. So great background experience to bring to this. You could probably do some needs for us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate that. I just want to make sure we don't have any other questions before we move on. Okay, I did want to also add just to the last question that Gary had posed and Jason's answer. So I do watch a lot of review board or boards who in the review capacity often have the issue with moving into the realm of, well, if I had been there, I would have done this. And so just to kind of reiterate something that Jason's talked about throughout is going where the facts lead you as opposed to where your own personal experience leads you. Of course, experience plays into it to a certain extent, but you have to make sure that the facts are backing up what you're seeing and what you're thinking, as opposed to just saying, well, why didn't he do it this way? He could have just gone in there and just removed him from the theater and asked him to take his hat off, or 1,000 different other things. And it's really about finding where you can see the facts in the issue, which then leads me to that next statement that Gary said, the he said, she said situation, which is one of the most frustrating scenarios in investigations and civilian oversight, because you will probably have a lot of cases that come before you where there aren't witnesses, where it is one person's word against another, and which often become a case where no one is satisfied with the outcome. So we're constantly in the oversight world looking for ways to better analyze situations like that, think of better outcomes. Sometimes, you have enough of the he said, she said events, you realize that, well, maybe there's something to this, or maybe there's a need for a policy change. So there are some ways that you can also look at those somewhat frustrating instances and turn them into something beneficial in the long run. So again, Jason, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to just take some of the remaining time here to talk to you about our next topic. Let me share my screen again. Bear with me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about recommended reporting practices. So from hearing all of your backgrounds, I feel fairly confident all of you have been involved in the writing or research for reports in your professional lives. But civilian oversight, we just want to talk a little bit about not only what should be in these reports, but how they benefit the process as a whole, the process of civilian oversight. So first, I know that your ordinance talks about two specific instances where reports are issued. You have your annual report that's issued by September 1st of every year. And then you have the report after each completed investigation. So first I want to focus on this annual report. As a general rule, reports should include your mission, authority, activity, and accomplishments. And even though you may have said it in the previous report, you need to remember who your audience is. You may have people who come in 3 years after the start of your entity who know nothing about you but pick up a report. You need to make sure that you are driving home to everybody who you are, why you're there, what your authority is, what you've done over the past year, what your accomplishments are. And I also would not, I would not tell you to shy away from things that you would like to do better in the future, things you're working towards. I think transparency, since part of civilian oversight's mission is to build accountability and transparency, I think it's really important for that to exist within civilian oversight as well. And so if there are ways in which the agency itself can improve in the future, no one should be afraid of letting the public know about those different things. You have to remember that this is the primary source of information about the operations and public interaction, not only of the civilian oversight entity, but also of law enforcement, because it will say a lot about the interactions that end up in the complaint process. Although you are required to issue one, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, although you're required to report one, there is nothing wrong with issuing special reports on things that are of special interest to the public. It really should be logically divided into sections corresponding with the various activities that the agency performs. Really, when you look at most oversight agencies, annual reports, you could probably compare them to their ordinance and the authorities outlined in the ordinance, and it follows almost as a roadmap from the ordinance. If there are lengthy reports you'd like to talk about or issues within the report that you'd like to talk about that could be quite lengthy, you should summarize them. Again, remember your audience. You don't want to lose them. You want to keep them engaged. If there is a secondary report that needs to be issued that is not summarized, then that's always an option. But in the annual report, remember to keep it concise and easy to understand for the general public. Reporting on recommendations issued is really important. It's one of the things that the public will be looking for. They'll also be looking for how were those recommendations accepted or not accepted. You need to make sure that you are referencing any additional information concerning recommendations and the recommendation status. Also, data and infographics. I won't just say that the public loves pictures. I mean, I love pictures and reports too. They often go a long way in helping explain the sometimes lengthy explanation of different things, but infographics about caseloads and complaint allegations and dispositions, officer and complaint demographics, complaint geographies, also including some comparative data from prior years to measure is very useful in showing trends and activity over time. But just remember that data should be accompanied by basic explanations concerning the measurement. You also have to be cautious about making casual inferences regarding changes in the data. So for instance, sustained rates is one I often refer to. You know, a lot of times people will put up the dispositions of cases. So say in 2020, we had 15 sustained cases. And in 2021, we had 5. So there are so many things that could go into how that decrease in sustained complaints occurred, that it has just on the surface, just the numbers itself has very little meaning. However, a lot of people could look at that and say, hey, look, everything's fine. Or conversely, if you have a year where you have a rise in sustained complaints, everybody can say, look, the police department is falling apart. There are all these complaints and there's misconduct everywhere. And that's not necessarily the case. It could be that you did an excellent job in outreach to the community, and so more people knew about the complaint process. It could be, I'm not sure if I told you the example in the last time we met about the recruit class that was trained on chokeholds from someone from a different agency where chokeholds were allowed. So there was an increase in complaints and sustained investigations or allegations because these recruits had been trained incorrectly, not because they were out looking to go against policy and procedure. It's because they were taught incorrectly. So there's just so many things. You have to be very careful in just casually putting out information and making assumptions or inferences from it without additional explanation. Because even if you think that, and you know that that isn't a, there isn't a whole lot behind a certain change over time, you better believe that people from the public, whether it is a member of the broader community, a member of an elected official, or a member of law enforcement, someone is going to make an assumption about those changes. That's why you have to make sure that there's information provided to explain. Special reports. So when you do a special investigation or there's a particular audit that's done on a very specific topic, then a special report is incredibly helpful to bring that information out into the public. A great example of this that I often use is the Inspector General for the New York Police Department. Now, again, if you don't remember from the last training, I often use examples of law enforcement agencies that are much smaller or much bigger, and it's a matter of scale. So don't automatically ever assume that because I'm talking about the NYPD that it's not something that's also important to the ACPD. So they did a special investigation on the use of force reporting. Lasted a year, an incredible amount of data went through the office. And at the end of that, they not only issued a set of recommendations for reporting practices, everything from when and how, but also changes to the forms that they report on. Once they submitted the recommendations, NYPD accepted, I think, 100% of the recommendations. They put this all into a report that is then widely available on their website. They then, I think it's also important to note in this specific case, and then a year and a half later, they began another audit so that they could look at not only if the recommendations had ever actually been implemented, but did they actually have benefit? Because it's really important to not only just make recommendations because you think that they will be beneficial, it's also important to see if they actually were. So a secondary report after that second investigation or audit was done was issued. So now there's a record of how, of not only the initial, but also the follow-up. And eventually, if needed, there'll be another audit at some point in the future. These special reports are also really important. I mentioned, widely available. Having reports available on your website and easily found on a website is really important. Again, that's back to the transparency and accountability piece. So publishing and presenting data. So data should be regularly published and presented in a clear and accessible format. So data on complaints, complainants, alleged victims, officer demographics, allegations, dispositions, and complaint geographies are some of the most vital information an oversight agency has at its disposal. Publishing raw data on a regular basis promotes transparency and public confidence, at least, but all of this, please note, is you can only publish what you are allowed to publish by law. Your ordinance reminds you regularly about what that you can only present. Those things, information must be kept confidential. That is meant to be kept confidential by law, whether that is criminal or juvenile information, anything that is contains personally identifiable information. All of that needs to be kept out of it, but what can be published should be published regularly. A great example of this is in Portland. The Independent Police Review publishes several years of data on its website at any given time. It includes complaints that come in, intake decisions, because when they have an intake, they classify it, and there are some they take that they aren't able to investigate because per their ordinance. So they let people know what numbers are not able to be investigated. Closure reasons, complainant demographics, and the IPR website allows members of the public to download the raw data and includes an appendix describing the data's sources. So there's additional information there so that they have a little bit more background on where the data has come from. So reporting is important because it's critical to your credibility and the law enforcement's credibility. The more information the public receives, the more information they have and the better understanding they have, not only of law enforcement and misconduct that's occurring in their community, but also you're a new entity. It is important for people to know what you're doing, how you're doing it, and a constant reminder of what you actually can do. It's important that these reports, other than the modifications that have to be made to protect identity, they should not be censored or modified by political stakeholders or law enforcement. They need to be written in a very accessible manner. And they should include as much information related to the agency's mandate and operation that can be disclosed by law. This allows the public to better understand you. And it includes, including patterns and trends and complaints or discipline, as well as the agency's recommendations and activities for the year. Discussion of concerns to the public, because as you do your community outreach, you will start to have a better understanding of those issues that are most important to the community where you're concerned. And so having all of that and then reporting out on it will be incredibly useful as you move forward. So I'm going to stop there and see if any of you have any questions on reporting.
Gary, again, just with one question. Mm-hmm. So obviously, I'm glad you had that bullet there, not modified or influenced by law enforcement. But should there be coordination, obviously, before we release a report, though we're independent, is it good practice to at least have that transparency with with the police department? Here's our stuff, here's what's going to be published, to give them, even though we're independent, we're still in the same county. So to give them ample awareness before they get a, public going, hey, what's going on? Yeah. Can you just briefly comment on that?
Absolutely. So in almost every jurisdiction that I can think of, it is common practice to show the report to law enforcement, to political stakeholders before it's released. It also gives them a moment to respond so that they also can follow up your release with their response. You know, in the case of, you know, specific recommendations that you might make because of an audit or looking at different complaints, it gives them the opportunity to say, yes, we've seen the recommendations and we agree with them. Or in some cases, not agree with them, and this is why. It helps get the information, all of the information out to the public more quickly. But the line is where if people are trying to audit it, where that becomes a problem. But sharing it ahead of time, particularly since it affects law enforcement, is common.
Okay, thank you. That's what I assumed. I just wanted to verify. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? You all are being a very easy group today. Thank you. I will say one other thing is that as you start to write your reports, there are some really great examples out there to follow. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are some agencies who have an auditor monitor and a board who could provide some great templates. Denver is an excellent one. They're currently in transition with their monitor, but there are all of their reports are online, and not only does the monitor's office put out an annual report, but so does their board, because the perspectives are slightly different. New Orleans, although they don't have a board, and Mummy will be very familiar with their reports, New Orleans has put out excellent reports for years. So there's some great ones. San Jose, California has always put out one of the better reports out there, and it's because they take a lot of time to put in a lot of detail. And once you get to that point, when you're ready to put out your first report, just know that we're always available to say, hey, here are some links to just some to get you started. So don't feel like even though that's your first annual report is so far from now, I'm assuming you're not doing one that's by September 1st of this year because you're still training and getting everything ready. But it seems so far away, but just know we'll be here to help provide some guidance when you get to that point.
Well, actually, we are required to do one this year.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. So we've been, but you know, we've had discussions about it, and we think it's a good opportunity to at least tell people all the training we've been doing, and you know, whatever we have. It doesn't have to be long, but yeah, we do have to.
Well, actually, that's great. It's your first opportunity to set those start setting expectations and get your voices out there to the community. So that's great.
So does anybody else have any last questions? I'm not seeing anything. I just wanted to thank you again for all of this. It's really useful to have such practical information because, you know, we're just starting up and thinking a lot about all of these issues. You'll be happy to know that there are an unusually high number of data wonks on this COB, and
I love it.
and people who've done a lot of research and analysis and who are dying to start thinking about data and collecting data and what we're going to do with it. So, which is not to say that we won't probably reach back to you and, you know, ask for ideas or support, or, you know, where do you think we could look at what other people have done? And all of the information on investigations was extremely helpful. Personally, I really liked the table. I love tables. I love simple tools to organize information. Often people don't take that extra step, and I think it makes a big difference in just understanding and processing. So I love stuff like that. So it was really nice to see that. Yeah, so we really look forward to hearing more from you next week. And I can't thank you enough. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything before we close this part out. Please, again, don't sign off because we still have to approve some minutes. But any last words before we let our esteemed colleagues off to enjoy their evening?
This is Gary again. Yeah, I forgot to ask that one question. Yeah, the templates, the people that have done this before, particularly on the data thing, as you said, many of us have had conversations about that. I know ACPD is already kind of, ahead of the game in that, but obviously from our site picture, I'm sure we'll be looking for, who's doing this good, get us kind of to a, version 1 or version 2 pretty quickly. A starting point, and obviously we'll end up tailoring that for Arlington and kind of what our mandate is. But thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure being with you again. When we're back with you on Tuesday, one of the things that we'll be covering, we'll be talking about challenges and opportunities. I'll be joined by another former NACOLE president who actually helped as Arlington County was considering oversight, Brian Core. And so he enjoys an interactive session. So just be ready for some crowd participation. So it'll be great to see you again next week.
Great, and thank you again, and have a great evening. But I'm not saying that to the COB members because you're all staying. You guys can go and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, so for us, we just have one last piece of business, or unless, I started that wrong. What I should have, no, I started that right. I always have to look at my cheat sheet of the way I'm supposed to be doing this. Okay, so we have some meeting notes that we have to approve, and they've been shared with everybody. Specifically, it's the July 7th and the July 19th meeting notes. So they've been distributed and reviewed by the Community Oversight Board. Are there any corrections that anybody wants to make on those? No? Okay, so hearing none, then I'll entertain the motion to adopt the minutes from July 7th and 19th, if anybody wants to make that motion.
So I'll move that we adopt the minutes from the July 7th and July 19th meetings.
Great. Does anybody want to second?
I second that.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just take a vote. Everybody in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, great. So we've adopted those minutes for the July 7th and the July 19th. And are there any other pieces of business that anybody would like to bring up or mention before we close out our meeting?
Lisa, this is Gary. As Lisa said to everybody, we've started this conversation about reports, and I will be reaching out to the COB to see if I can find somebody to kind of lead our effort in here. You won't be alone. As we just heard, we'll get some benchmarks from other people, but this first one is going to be kind of a hybrid because we're still in training. But I really think this public starting to hear about us. I mean, there is some goodness that we can put in here, but don't need a name right now. But if this is something that you can take the lead in, you won't be by yourself here again. You're going to have, me and Lisa here helping to guide, but we just need somebody who maybe, likes to kind of pull things together. And so that's just one of that. I'm only going to talk about that ask today. To help us all kind of move forward. So 1 September, we got, you know, another month here. August starts next month. So we'd like to, if you, you know, and I have a couple of people in mind, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity first before I have a few people I want to call. So thank you.
Okay, great. And just to say that we don't actually, there is no specified deadline for the report. Normally they're done by September 1st. I took the executive decision to let it slide to the 30th of September just because we've had so much other stuff going on. So just to let whomever might be interested in doing this know that you're going to have more time than you might think. And also this can be quite short. I don't think it's a really heavy lift, but it's a good opportunity for somebody who's interested in starting to shape sort of the way that we are telling our story. So I'm going to put in a plug. So hopefully someone will be interested in doing that. Any other pieces of business?
This is Dave Smith. Did we get a template from NACOLE for the MOU? Because I think Cammie said last time that there were templates or other reports that we could look at least. Just curious if we have those, and if not, we probably could get them. And in fact, the report she mentioned from Denver, I mean, I'll take a look at that. She said it was online on Denver's equivalent to the COB. So maybe we don't need to ask her for that. Just to take a look at in terms of the MOU. She did mention last time that she had some available, or maybe there were, yeah, just curious about that.
So I have not circled back with her. We have a few other pieces of the puzzle we have to put together before we can start on the MOU, which, as you know, keeps me up at night because I do know that we need to do it and it's very important. But I don't know if Mummy wants to say anything about it. We haven't reached out, but we certainly can, and I'm sure that we will. I don't know if Mummy's still here, actually. She may have had to.
You know, in terms of the MOU, I think we probably want to just like get clear about roles and responsibilities. I certainly have an MOU from, you know, like New Orleans, as I mentioned on our last NACOLE training, one that is currently being revised, so not like its final form. The New Orleans one specifically is what I'm referring to, but something that we can use kind of as like a reference point, if you will, or, you know, just to see kind of what's included in one. But in terms of, you know, readiness for the COB, the MOU is something that I think, you know, once we are at least almost complete with our training, or, you know, after we complete our training is when we probably want to set a realistic deadline for when the MOU is going to be completed. But obviously it involves, you know, a couple other stakeholders that we want to involve in the conversation in terms of setting a deadline, and also the heavy lift of the MOU in terms of drafting it is very likely going to be something that myself and Captain Chamberlain will be doing like more of the heavy lifting on in terms of drafting it, and obviously, you know, working in collaboration with you all to make sure that any of the pieces of the puzzle that are spelled out in the ordinance as it pertains to the COB. Sorry, y'all, that's our 11th COB member, my daughter. Yeah, so in terms of just spelling out anything in the ordinance that the COB specifically is involved in, or any concerns that need to be addressed as it pertains to the COB will be included in there. But when you think of the MOU, I think like just the easiest way to think about it is that it's mostly going to be wanting to detail how we work together, you know, in this oversight model with ACPD. And in that regard, I would be serving as you all's professional support staff person and be taking the lead in terms of like drafting that in conjunction with, in partnership with Captain Chamberlain. So I don't know that that's ever really been like clearly spelled out, and I don't know that the ordinance really like explicitly assigns the responsibility. It's mentioned in one of the things that need to be completed for readiness, but there are other things as well that need to be completed for readiness. But as far as what I see in the statute, like the only thing that has a time limit kind of like or a timeline around it is the training, which is why that has been, you know, the #1 priority in terms of getting that done. And that's the one thing that, you know, each COB member has an individual and a group responsibility to complete. So I think that's like been that's probably like one area where we can very clearly define like individual roles and responsibilities. But I thought that the MOU, even the complaint intake system, which that one is a little bit more clear in the ordinance, it does explicitly state that the IPA would create the complaint intake system. Obviously, I will be doing that in collaboration with you all. And then once the intake system is up and running at the conclusion of our training, and once we're like ready to pass the readiness resolution, then both the COB and myself would be responsible for taking complaints, which is why obviously it's paramount that you all have input along the way. But I just wanted to make sure that it's clear that those two things, particularly the complaint intake system and the MOU, are not like a primary responsibility of the COB, such that it should keep anyone up at night, or it should be anything that we are thinking is like that we're on an encroaching deadline on. We haven't really set any deadlines yet, and we probably can until we engage other stakeholders and find out what's a reasonable deadline from their perspective as well.
So just to clarify, what the reason it was keeping me up at night is because I had not gone back and looked at the ordinance, and I didn't realize that we can't be certified without it. So my concern was that somehow we would end up being certified, and it wasn't done. But we have to have it done in order to be certified.
That makes sense. She's singing her ABC. Sorry.
And one other quick question about the training. I think, are we on track to be able to say in the September report that we've completed our training? I think that's pretty much a requirement, isn't it? I'm not sure what the final deadline is.
I don't think we will have completed it by then. I mean, Jim can speak to this more, but I thought that October 31st was really the deadline. But we will be, you know, God, 80% of the way through, if not better, by then, as long as everybody, as Mummy said, this is a collective and also an individual responsibility. So individuals who've missed any pieces or haven't done their ride-alongs or whatever, all of that has to get done before we can be certified. So it's going to keep the group from moving forward if everybody doesn't get it done. But anyway, I don't know if you want to say anything more, Jim, but yeah, I thought October 31st was the deadline.
No, you're right on, Lisa. That said, September we will have an excellent opportunity to highlight our training efforts thus far. And depending on when the report is due, if it's beyond September 20th, for example, which will be our second training session within that month, we will have completed nearly upwards of 80 to 85% of our training efforts. And
hey, this is Gary, just to support Jim here. Jim has finally authority to establish his the training sub-channel on our COB team site. So he's had this mental picture. He was just waiting to get the authority to get it in there. So hopefully soon, Jim, that will help us out. And I guess the last thing, it's really all of us, you know, none of us, this isn't about individuals. It's really about us as a COB, how we present ourselves. And I guess, you know, school's getting ready to come here pretty soon. And the county ACPD is flexible. Let's use example of the ride-alongs. I had them approach me 2 hours into it and said, sir, I've covered everything. You've asked all the questions. It's late. If you need to go home, I'll let you go. But they had some things they were going to do. And I said, no, I'm staying. I had one actually where they had a little bit of excitement where I really got to see them work. But my whole point is, if you've got individual situations, you know, show up on time. They'll work with you. Okay, so don't be afraid of, oh gosh, you know, it's 4 hours and it's middle of the night. Just so far, you know, they worked with me, and it just, I almost did it, but they said, hey, there's 2 calls we're going to go respond to. So please, let's all just try to get it done. And thank you, Jim, for getting the framework for us and keeping it visible for us.
no doubt. Well, a lot of that effort Thank you, Gary, for highlighting that point. A lot of that effort goes to Captain Chamberlain and her team. Please do, I'll echo those same comments. Please do contact her and let her know what your schedule and availability is like. And if you have issues while you've already scheduled them, just real simple email and a follow up to her and her team so that they can best prepare for scheduling within those officers at that time. As mentioned, they're really they are flexible so long as we're able to communicate them effectively prior to and scheduled. As mentioned, the view of Arlington through the windshield of a police cruiser looks a lot different. So
yeah, I have to echo that, and particularly those ride-alongs are really important. And you know, my problem is different, where I've got a lot going on right now. I'm going to have to push off finishing my ride-alongs, but I've started them, and I think it's really important that everybody at least start them. You know, when I got there 15 minutes early, and they were already standing there waiting for me. I figured, you know, I was going to have to be waiting. They were waiting and ready, and you know, this is important to them, and you know, they want us there. So you know, we have to, and you learn so much, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm sure that, you know, getting the opportunity to do it at different times or doing it on the weekend or whatever would work for you better, they'd probably be open to that. And, you know, it's a really important opportunity. But anyway.
Yeah, no, totally. Just to add on one real quick thing. Literally in the first 10 minutes of the second ride along I had, I was with a sergeant named Patrick Smithgall, and literally in the first 10 minutes, he got a call from someone who he had to inform her brother had died of an overdose that day. So he was in the car talking to her. He did a fantastic job. I mean, that's a very difficult conversation. She knew that something had happened. The police had gone there, but he died at the scene of an overdose. So he explained that to her. And then in about 2 minutes later, the officer who was there at the scene said his wife was going into labor right then. So he had to leave. So the guy had to find somebody else to do the paperwork. And then in like the next 5 minutes, he said, oh, there's 2 citizen complaints with regard to officers' misconduct. And he showed him, they were actually on the screen in the car. And he's like, you know, I have to deal with this. So it was very open, very transparent. Literally, that was while we were driving from, all in the space of driving from the police station at Courthouse to the the impound lot. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. And I was like, you know, this guy has got a lot going on. He is juggling a lot. And I was really impressed. And later, actually, I ended up with somebody else and then went back with him. And we had a call with regard to a person with a gun. So, you know, lights went on, we went flying around. So it was actually a very interesting and eventful and educational 4 hours.
Yeah, agreed. I mean,
I just encourage everybody to do it. Yeah.
I think everybody's experience has been different, but really, really valuable. So thanks for all of that. I don't want to close this out, but I want to try and get us finished on time to be respectful of everybody's time. So the only last thing is if people, actually, we have nothing else to do. So you can talk for 2 more minutes and then we can adjourn, or we can adjourn now. So if there's any, let's go ahead and adjourn. Okay, great. And then you can have a whole minute back. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn if someone so wants to make that motion.
Gary, I think to adjourn our meeting tonight.
Okay, someone would like to second that?
I'll second it.
Okay, great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, great. I declare the meeting closed, and you get a whole minute back, so use it wisely, and see you all next Tuesday.
Thanks a lot.